Hello again. My name is Dr. Ian Cyrus. My practice is the Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine Center located in Fort Washington, Pennsylvania. My website is eastasianmed.com. And, for this installment, we're going to talk a little bit about different types of trigger points. Okay, keep in mind that not all trigger points are created equal. Use of the term trigger point has become a very generic, I would say, not very descriptive reference to a hyperertable zone in a taut band, which is basically the definition of a myofascial trigger point. But there are many other types of trigger points, and being able to identify the different types of trigger points can be helpful in leading to clinical success. So let's take a look at first and foremost what's known as a central trigger point. That is a trigger point that is in the belly of the muscle. Now, I'm going to read right from a description, and this is also described, this central trigger point, as I said, is in the belly of the muscle. It can also be described as a motor point. That's where all the motor neuron axons meet the myofilaments, okay? So you have a greater concentration of nerve endings, so to speak, at the level of the trigger point. And that in itself could be a clinical problem, because what happens when you find a motor point is that the muscle spindles associated with that motor point has failed, okay? And proper needle technique reactivates the muscle spindle so that it can monitor stretch and not cause your joints to become unstable. But by definition, a motor point is the most electrically excitable area of the muscle or neuromuscular junction, where the motor nerve enters the belly of the muscle, representing the greatest concentration of nerve endings, as I've said. They are not anatomical points, and they follow a fairly fixed location. So by and large, if you look at a muscle, wherever the belly of the muscle is where you're going to find a trigger, a motor point. Motor points evoke a twitch response to minimal electrical stimulation, producing a contraction elsewhere in the muscle. In other words, motor points has the lowest resistance to electrical conductivity. And as I said, appropriate needling seems to reset the dysfunctional muscle spindles associated with motor points. Okay? So keep that in mind. But then again, we're talking about what is a central trigger point and what is a motor point. Now let's look at what's known as a terminal trigger point, right? Terminal trigger point. This represents a big clinical problem, because most people, they find the trigger point is usually in the belly of the muscle, which is really a motor point or a central trigger point. And they needle that and they get a couple of twitches and call it a day, right? What most don't realize is that myofascial trigger points can occur anywhere in the muscle, including its tendinous or ligamentous attachments, okay? So you can have trigger points in the terminal end of the muscle, which is why it's called terminal trigger points. And the clinical problem here is that you needle a central trigger point and you get a couple of good twitches, local twitch responses from the muscle, and you go on about your business. Well, within 24 hours, that trigger point is going to become activated, because the terminal trigger points, which is at the attachment, which is the origin and insertion of the muscles, you have to follow the muscle all the way to its attachment points, and more than likely you will find myofascial trigger points there. So those are known as terminal trigger points, okay? Now, you have key trigger points. Now, what is a key trigger point? A key trigger point is responsible for activating one or more satellite trigger points. All right, and a satellite trigger point, like you have a upper trapezius muscle. That's what this is, and this trigger point in the upper trapezius muscle can activate trigger points in the temporalis muscle. So it's along that reference zone, which is a whole other concept. But in the field of acupuncture, it's the gallbladder channel, right? It's just that one part of the channel versus another, all right? So you can have a key trigger point at, say, gallbladder 21, and it can activate trigger points in or around or along the temporalis muscle, which includes gallbladder 8, or for instance, okay? So that's what a key trigger point does. By the same token, if you deactivate a key trigger point, it will deactivate the satellite trigger point. So you have to know the difference between a key trigger point and a satellite trigger point. Okay? Now, an associated trigger point, which I don't have listed here, is a trigger point in one muscle that occurs concurrently with the trigger point in another muscle. And what that's saying is that if you develop a trigger point in the upper trapezius muscle, say around gallbladder 21 again, okay, it can activate concurrently a trigger point in the temporalis muscle because it's in that referred pain pattern or reference zone. Okay? So, let's see here. A latent trigger point, and this is important because oftentimes a trigger point may not be painful upon palpation or hyper-irritable, but it's still a trigger point even though it's not, in your understanding, sort of like active, okay? Which is a trigger point that will exhibit pain upon digital palpation or compression. But a latent trigger point where the muscle fibers, there's an increased tension in the muscle and shortening, but no pain. Let me say that again. A latent trigger point can exist with respect to increased muscle tension and shortening of the muscle, but does not exhibit any pain. So if you leave it alone and you don't understand that that needs to be addressed, it's only a matter of time before that trigger point, that latent trigger point, becomes active and activates other trigger point in other distant locations. Okay? So a primary trigger point, which isn't here as well, a primary trigger point is a central myofascial trigger point that was activated directly by acute or chronic overload. So what we're saying here is that a primary trigger point could also be at the motor point. It can also be a central trigger point. But it was activated directly by acute or chronic overload or repetitive overuse of the muscle in which it occurs, and was not activated as a result of trigger point activity in another muscle. So a primary trigger point basically is saying that by direct overload of the muscle or direct trauma to the muscle, it activated the central trigger point, the motor point, and what have you. So I just wanted to take some time just to sort of like flush out that when you use the term trigger points, think that there are 9 or 10 different types of trigger points. And again, understanding the difference between these trigger points are very important. Okay? Thank you. And I will be discussing another aspect of these trigger points in the near future. Thank you again.